bottom and click Spanish. So as I said, my name is Neil Ramos. I'm Director of Community Engagement for the Sonoma Land Trust, and I'll be your host tonight. The presentation is scheduled for about an hour, which will be followed by 30 minutes of question and answer at the end. You can submit your questions via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A session. Questions in the chat will get lost over time as people enter other things, so we will not be answering any questions entered in the chat, and we encourage you all to answer your questions or submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit that protects land in Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976 and have protected over 56,000 acres in our county so far. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members and contributors, so thanks to all of you out there who are helping us protect beautiful Sonoma County for future generations. As we pursue that mission to conserve land and our mission of protecting Sonoma County, we at Sonoma Land Trust recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples who called Sonoma County home. We honor their knowledge and care and stewardship of this special place across the ages, and Sonoma Land Trust wants to recognize and acknowledge the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted upon them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. And I want to personally encourage all of you to learn more about the indigenous communities of where you live. And you can do that on the website native-lands.ca. And it will show you all the historical territories of the indigenous communities of our area in Sonoma County in California. With that, I would like to invite Mariska and Sara to turn on your cameras and join the conversation, and I'll introduce both of you. Mariska Obedzinski is a California Sea Grant Extension Specialist based in a Sea Grant office in Windsor, California, just north of where I am in Gitati. She and a team of biologists, AmeriCorps members, and interns conduct monitoring and research to support salmon and steelhead recovery in coastal California. Mariska is personally fascinated with stream ecology and is driven to get science off the shelf and into the hands of those working to protect and restore our coastal environment. She has coordinated the Russian River Salmon and Steelhead Monitoring Program for over 15 years, and prior to that, worked on Atlantic salmon recovery efforts in Maine. One of those people taking that science and turning it into protection work is Sara Press, our very own from Sonoma Land Trust. Sara has worked to protect land and water in Sonoma County since 2008, first at the Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District, and then for Sonoma Land Trust since 2019. Sara's work has resulted in the protection of over 10,000 acres countywide through conservation easement transactions, transfers for park additions, and other land protection methods. Sara now manages SLT's acquisition efforts in the Russian River watershed and coastal region, focusing on water and fish resources. She also manages the Land Trust strategic planning efforts, which I, as a director of the organization, appreciate with no bounds. With that, I would love to invite Mariska and Sara to get us going on this chat tonight.
All right, are we good to go? Can you see the slides?
We are good to go. Thanks, Mariska.
Great. Thank you, Neil. And thanks to all of you for being here on a weeknight and your interest in salmon and learning about some of the really low flows that we're starting to see in some of the creeks in the watershed and how that's impacting the salmon populations. A little bit of background on salmon in the Russian. There are 3 different species, Coho, Chinook, and Steelhead. And each of these species has a little bit different niche. They occupy different parts of the watershed and they have a little bit different life history strategy. We'll start with coho. They are the most imperiled of the three. They're endangered. In the early 2000s, we only knew of fewer than 10 fish returning to the watershed each year. So they really almost disappeared from the watershed altogether. We are seeing the numbers increase, but a long way to go. The coho typically have a 3-year life cycle. About half of that time is spent in fresh water in the tributaries in the lower part of the basin. And then they migrate out to the ocean, spend another 1.5 years there feeding and growing and getting big. And then they migrate back to the tributaries to reproduce. And one of the things to note about where they live in freshwater is the tributaries where they spawn tend to have really, really low flows in the summer season, to the point where they become disconnected from the river altogether. And so when they come back as adults, which is usually in the early winter, November, December, they have to wait for the first really big rainstorm of the winter in order for the tributaries to reconnect and to be able to migrate into the habitat where they like to spawn. Chinook salmon are threatened. There's on average about 3,000 adults returning to the watershed to spawn. They have usually a 2 to 4 year life cycle, and they spawn in really different habitat. It's more the larger tributaries and the main stem of the river. And what that means in terms of flow is they don't have to wait for those first really big winter rainstorms in order to access the places that they like to spawn. There's usually enough flow in the fall. As long as the mouth of the river is open, they can come in and spawn earlier than the coho. And another big difference with Chinook is that they don't spend as much time in the freshwater as the coho. They just spend a few months rather than 1.5 years, and then the majority of their time in the ocean. Steelhead are also threatened, and they have a really, really different life history pattern. It's way more diverse than either coho or Chinook. They can spend their entire life in freshwater. If they do that, they're called a rainbow trout. They can spend a few months in freshwater, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, then go out to the ocean. Another big difference is that coho and Chinook, they get one shot at spawning. So they migrate back from the ocean, they spawn, they lay their eggs, and that's it, they die. Steelhead have many more options. If they can survive the migration and all the energy expenditure of spawning, they have an option of going back out to the ocean, spending another year in the ocean, and then repeating the journey back to the streams to spawn. And they can do that multiple times. Their window of time for spawning is also a lot longer. It spans 6 months. They can come back in early December or all the way to May. They also, you can see from this map, they spawn in a lot more different places than the other 2 species. And because of these crazy different life history strategies and the amount of habitat that they occupy, it's really, really hard to monitor these populations. They're always just really challenging. And so it's hard to actually estimate how many are coming back to the watershed each year. So we don't really know. We think it's in the low thousands, but we really don't have a good way of estimating that. Just a quick peek at the life cycle. So the adults come back from the river, from the ocean to spawn. They dig a nest in the stream bed, in the gravel, and lay their eggs. And this is typically in the winter when the flows are high. And then they have this weird little life stage called an alvin. They hatch under the gravel, and they spend time under the gravel using up this little yolk sac. And once that's used up, they emerge into the stream. And then in the case of Coho and Steelhead, they have an extended period of time living in the stream environment. Then in the spring, after a year or a couple years, they transform into a fish that can tolerate salt water. And at that stage, they're called a smolt. And they migrate out to the ocean, where they spend typically a year and a half, and then migrate back to the streams as an adult. Chinook are pretty similar, with the exception of they don't have this par stage. They essentially just spend a few months in freshwater and go right out to the ocean. Salmon recovery in the Russian River watershed has really focused on coho salmon, which are the most imperiled. Historically, we know they at least existed in all of these streams here. By the early 2000s, they were only found in 2 of those streams in any real numbers. And it's really kind of a typical salmon saga of death by 1,000 cuts that all kind of boil down to habitat loss. Efforts to restore the coho runs really also benefit steelhead, coho, and other aquatic species. So it's not a bad choice to focus on coho salmon for recovery. A lot of the initial recovery strategies have focused on improving habitat in the stream environment. So coho salmon, in order to make it through the summer, they need cold, clear water, and they absolutely love crazy complex jumbles of tree roots and branches and logs. If you're in a stream and you see this stuff, that is where the coho are going to be. They need this kind of habitat to hide from predators, and it also provides refuge from really high flows in the winter season. So there's just been a lot of work to put wood back in the streams. Another strategy has just been trying to increase the amount of habitat available. So fixing, some of these passage barriers, like remediating dams. That's a lot of work has been done to improve that. Another strategy has been a conservation hatchery that's based up at Warm Springs Dam and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so the idea is to try to give the population a boost by stocking hatchery fish into a number of tributaries every year. The long-term goal of this effort is to restore self-sustaining runs. We don't want to be stocking hatchery fish forever, but the population was so low, it was gonna disappear without releasing fish. So how do we know if these strategies are working? That's where the monitoring comes in. So at California Sea Grant, we've been tracking these fish populations since the first releases of Coho in 2004. And there's a lot of other efforts. We work very closely with Sonoma Water and Department of Fish and Wildlife, who are also doing a lot of monitoring, long-term monitoring of fish populations in the basin. There's a couple different scales of monitoring that we do. So one of them is to do this really intensive life cycle monitoring. So we have 4 streams that are in the lower part of the watershed, where we're just doing this really in-depth monitoring. We're trying to estimate how many fish there are at each of these life stages, how well they're surviving the different seasons, how well they're growing. And these are places where we can test out different hatchery release strategies or different habitat enhancement projects and how effective they are. We also do monitoring at a basin-wide scale. So we want to know at the higher level, are these fish recovering? And so we work very closely to track the status and trends of all 3 species with Sonoma Water and Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is part of a statewide effort to track these populations called the Coastal Monitoring Program. And this map is just giving an example. We can't do that intensive monitoring on all of the streams in the Russian River watershed. So we have this subsampling approach where we have reaches, that we sample every year, but then we have other reaches that we kind of rotate every 3 years or every 12 years. So just to give you an idea of some of the methods we use for monitoring, in the spring, this is when the smolts are migrating out to the ocean. So these are coho that are about 1.5 years old, and they're ready to head out to the ocean. They all swim past the mouth of the creek. And so we put these traps in near the mouths of the creeks, and that allows us to catch fish, count them, measure them to see how well they're growing. We can scan them for tags, and we can put tags in them. Another way that we are tracking these populations is using pit tag technology. So a pit tag is a little tag the size of a grain of rice. And each tag has a unique code. These are the same microchips that people use in their cats and dogs to track them if they get lost. We put them in fish, and then we set up these antennas in the streams. And when the tagged fish swim over the antennas or under the antennas, we have a transceiver up on the bank that records the tag number and the date and the time. You can kind of think of it as like a fast track system for fish, and it tells us when the fish are coming and going and where they're coming from and going to, and it helps us estimate survival in the freshwater environment and survival in the saltwater environment. In the winter season, this is a fun time of year. It's when the adults are returning to spawn. So this is a female coho salmon. And so what happens is they migrate up into the stream. The female digs a hole in the stream bed and then lays her eggs. And then the males come in and fertilize the eggs, and then the female buries them. And the nest is called a redd, and we can walk the creeks and look for fish and document where we're seeing these redds. And that allows us to create maps showing the habitat that's really important for fish. So each triangle is on this map is where we saw a redd, and it's kind of color coded by the different species. This time of year is really fun. The fish at this time of year, the juvenile fish have already emerged into the streams, and they're big enough to for us to be able to see them and count them. We have a little coho here in the upper left and a steelhead in the lower right. So we snorkel pools and then count fish, and then we can create maps showing the density of where we're seeing fish. So larger dots mean more fish. So you can kind of get an understanding of where in the stream is the important habitat for fish. And then one last type of survey that we do is called wet-dry mapping. About 10 years ago, we were seeing so much drying in the streams that we thought, we need to get a handle on the extent of this. How big of a limiting factor is it for fish? And so they're very simple surveys. We do them usually in September when the conditions are kind of at their driest. And we just walk the creeks and document where we see flowing water, where it's disconnected, and where it's totally dry. And then again, we can map this. So we can identify places, in blue that are refugia for fish that are trying to make it through the summer, that we want to protect, versus areas that are going dry or intermittent. These are places we want to focus our attention on trying to improve habitat. So what have we learned from doing all this monitoring? Definitely some good news. Here's where we were a decade ago, and we're seeing the distribution increase. We're seeing coho in a lot more streams than we have 10 years ago. And we're also seeing more fish. Here's where we were, a decade ago. There was almost nothing coming back. Following the hatchery releases, we started seeing this increase. It has leveled off, but we do have a few hundred adults coming back each year. So that's really, really encouraging. But we're really far from reaching recovery targets. We'd like to see over 10,000 adults coming back to the watershed each year. We were hoping to see this increasing trend continue. But what we think is happening is the hatchery fish that we release are making it out to the ocean. They're coming back and they're spawning, but the next generation is not able to complete its life cycle because of a whole suite of limiting factors. So one of the really big limiting factors that is the focus tonight is flow, low flow. And so low flow has become a problem for some different life stages. So the summer is kind of an obvious one. We don't get rain in the summer. Here's a pool on the left, a pool in the spring that has a lot of water. And then there's this progression throughout the course of the summer until it's just a tiny little puddle, or in some cases, totally dry. I get asked a lot, can't the fish just move into, the places that stay wet? And unfortunately, I wish I could answer yes, but really what we are seeing is that they're not moving to the places that stay wet. They're getting trapped in these pools and dying, either just getting totally stranded if the pools dry out, or just so stressed out because of poor water quality that they perish in the summer. The wet dry mapping that we do kind of helps us understand the extent of the problem. So these were the streams that we surveyed last year, and the red indicates stream habitat that went totally dry. And you can see it's more than half of the streams totally dried out. So another life stage that's really impacted by flows is in the spring. So this is a photo of a smolt. So this fish is about 1.5 years old. It's trying to make its way out to the ocean. And in order to do that, the fish need the streams to remain connected. They need that pathway to the ocean. They start, the smolt run, as we call it, starts usually in March, and it peaks. The most of the fish go out in late April, and then it kind of tapers off into June. But they need to be able to have this pathway open throughout that entire period to get to the ocean. And what we're seeing in recent years is that the creeks are becoming disconnected earlier and earlier. And so in many cases, like as early as actually March even this year, but in this example, the creek became disconnected in April. And what that means is, if it's that early, is the majority of these smolts are not able to get out to the ocean. And their chances of surviving another year in the stream are very, very low. So this is a really serious problem. You can really wipe out a whole year class if things cut off early. And then the last kind of flow impact that I wanted to touch on is actually in the winter, which is totally crazy. I never would have thought we'd see impacts of low flow in the winter when we have all the rain. But what we're seeing is that in some of these years where we don't have rain until January or February, this is really becoming a problem for the adults. They're anticipating flows, the rainstorms earlier, and so they come into the river, but the tributaries where they want to spawn are not accessible until that big rain. And in this year where we have this photo, we call it the zombie coho, it's got fungus. What we saw is that the fish just stayed in the river where the water temperatures are warmer and they're subject to predation. They just waited there until February, came in November, December, and then waited until February. And by the time they were able to get into the tributaries, they were in such bad shape that their offspring just had really poor survival. Another thing that we're seeing is like this past winter, we had this crazy high rainstorm in October, and then we had another, flashy storm in December. In those storms, the fish came into the tributaries. It was enough water to get them in, but then the flows dropped so quickly that the stream became disconnected, and some of the adults were stuck in pools and actually died just because the pools dried out. So that was just kind of unbelievable to see that. And then the last kind of impact that we've seen this year, with that same kind of pattern of a flashy storm and then no rain for 2 months, is some of the redds where the fish had laid their eggs became exposed. So the flows dropped so much that the redds had no water over them. And so, the eggs are not going to be able to survive without water. So just to kind of summarize some of these impacts, we're seeing low flow as a problem at all of these different life stages. In the summer, the stream drying is taking a toll on the juveniles that are trying to survive the summer. We're seeing issues with the smolts trying to migrate out to the ocean. The creeks disconnecting. We're seeing issues with adults not being able to access their spawning habitat, and then eggs and elvins drying out. So they're really taking a hit at all of these life stages. So lots of gloom and doom. This is a question I get asked all the time, given all of these impacts that you're seeing, is there any way that we're going to be able to, go from not enough water to being able to support enough water to support these fish? And I'm happy to say that I do think there is hope, but it is going to take a tremendous effort on the part of a lot of people in our watershed. I've been fortunate enough to be part of a group called the Coho Water Resources Partnership. So this is a group of biologists and hydrologists, resource conservation districts, and nonprofits, all working together to try to improve stream flow for fish, but also help people who live in the watershed get the water that they need, without having as much impact on the stream at the time that the fish need it the most. And in the Russian, it's really not a case of, there's one giant diversion where if we just fix that, it's going to be better for the fish. It's a case where, decades and decades of land use practices and many people living in the watershed alongside streams with, that need water. I'm one of them. I live on a salmon stream and I have a well that's 100 feet from the creek. And I know, that's that little part is playing a role in this. And so I think it's really going to take all of us working together to fix this, these impacts. As part of the Coho partnership, our role was to do some really intensive research. I'm not going to give a lot of detail here, but one of the questions that we were trying to figure out was how much water is needed in the streams in order for the fish to just be able to make it through the summer. And so we did all this. We tagged fish, we tracked them with these wands that we waved through the water. We measured temperature and flow and dissolved oxygen in a number of different streams. And the bottom line is that we learned that these fish can actually make it through the summer with a very small amount of water. More water is needed to really thrive, but even if we can get a tiny bit, like a couple hoses worth of water flowing between the pools, the fish can actually persist through the summer. So that gives me hope, because all of these little projects that might not put a lot of water back in the stream. If everyone does that, it could amount to, less than half a CFS. I mean, that seems more tangible to me, that we can get that much water back in the stream. So that's, that's something that I've held on to think that we could actually do this. I wanted to just highlight one other project that I've been part of on Porter Creek. So this is a stream that has, where a vineyard has been willing to release water from one of their water storage ponds at times when fish really need it. And so one of the things that we've been testing out here is if we do some pulsed releases just for a couple days or a few days in the spring when the creeks disconnect and the smolts are trying to get out, can we give some of these fish a pathway out of the creek? So these pictures kind of show what we were able to do with some of these releases. So in the upper right, the stream was totally disconnected. The smolts were trying to get out. So we turned on this flow release. It was about 1 CFS of water. Within about half a day, we were able to reconnect the stream, and that allowed about 200 smolts to get out of the stream. These fish that are highlighted with the green background, kind of at the peak of the run, they were able to get out. So just, a release like this timed properly can make a difference for the fish. And the other thing that I think is hopeful is just there's a lot of momentum right now to try to improve stream flow. A lot of nonprofits and some of the resource agencies are really offering support in trying to do some of these projects that will help improve flow. So things like water storage in tanks, water storage ponds, so diverting water either from the stream or wells in the winter season when water is more abundant, and then saving it for use in the summer. More efficient irrigation systems, grass that is drought tolerant, for frost protection. In some cases it's possible to do a frost protection fan instead of using water to frost protect. Things like flow releases, and then more tanks. So all of these things are going to help. And I do think there's a lot of momentum right now. And I think that's probably a good segue into Sara, who is going to be talking about some of the great work that the Land Trust is kind of embarking on right now. And I just want a quick acknowledgement. These monitoring efforts are really intensive, and so it takes a lot of really dedicated people to go out and survey these streams. And we're also just so grateful to the landowners that let us traipse through their property to access the streams. And the work we do is totally grant funded. So we definitely appreciate all of the support from a lot of different funders. And yeah, that is all I have. I'll hand it over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much. And I will share my presentation. And really, it does follow really nicely with how you set this up, Mariska. Being aware of this situation, the Land Trust decided we needed to do something about this as well, and get in there and try and address recovery. And so I'm going to talk about what the Land Trust is doing. And really, you know, just to back up for a minute, for over 45 years, the Land Trust land protection work has protected water and water assets. But we have a current strategic plan that says, let's ensure that water stays in the streams. And we call this securing freshwater flows. And so this is a particular area of focus for us now. And so in order to focus directly on the projects that will increase stream flow in these key locations, like Mariska's been showing us, we developed a conservation assessment that identifies the critical locations in the watershed. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So the goal of this conservation assessment is to identify the property ownerships that are high priority for some kind of conservation action, similar to what we just saw, that will have the most benefit on the survival of coho salmon. So my map will highlight some of the watersheds we were looking at earlier. And we focused on these 5 watersheds, which are Dutchbill Creek, Green Valley Creek, Mill, and Mark West Creek. Those are all most critical for coho. And then we also focused on Makama Creek watershed, which is critical for steelhead. And it's also where the Land Trust owns some key preserves. So that gives us an opportunity to do work on the ground ourselves. So the conservation assessment tells us 2 things. It tells us where to take action, but also which action to take in that location. And so the actions or project types can be categorized into our traditional acquisition and stewardship categories, as well as a new category of tools to use that we're calling water transactions. And I'm going to explain those a little bit more in the next few slides. So our traditional land trust tools, you know, acquisition includes purchasing or being gifted property that we manage as a preserve. We also buy land and we transfer it to other entities such as Sonoma County Regional Parks. We also acquire conservation easements, which restrict uses on the land so that so what's happening on the land is compatible with conservation. And then we also use riparian easements as a tool. And these are very similar to conservation easements, but they apply just to the riparian and floodplain areas. So we also have our traditional stewardship tools, which can address stream flow by how we manage our preserves. And this can vary in terms of how we manage the grasslands or the forest land, or more direct work such as creek restoration or fish barrier removal projects. And then we also work with our easement landowners and share information about best practices. So this is the kind of work that we do. And we are also primed to engage in water transactions, which can vary. It can include the purchase or lease of a water right in order to use it for in-stream flow. And so in-stream flow essentially means stream flow. We can also work with landowners on forbearance agreements, which say that the landowner forbears their water, so they don't divert water from a creek during certain periods within the dry season. Or like Mariska was talking about, we can negotiate and work with landowners on pond or reservoir release agreements, where water gets released from a pond or reservoir into a nearby stream to augment stream flow when it's needed the most. We can also work with landowners to change a water right or apply for a new water right to dedicate it to in-stream use for fish and wildlife benefit. So we look forward to working with landowners on this in order to keep the water in streams. So we want to do this in the places where it's going to make the most difference. And so we wanted to prioritize those properties. And how we did it is based on what we call a conservation value metric. So I'm going to start to get a little technical here, but bear with me, please. And this is how much conservation value there is on a particular property. The conservation value is based on these 3 elements that influence the health of our streams for coho. So these elements are the upland and riparian habitat, and this is the area that's outside the stream, but is connected to and influences the stream. So it's important. There's also the in-stream habitat, which is what's happening within the stream channel and the banks that provide habitat for fish. And then the third element is stream flow, which is both the water that's in the stream, but it's also the water that infiltrates further upland. So it infiltrates the surface and recharges groundwater that eventually makes its way into the stream channels, because that's a really important source for stream flow as well. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more, but I wanted to show this map, which is just an example from Green Valley Creek watershed. So if you put all this, the conservation values from all of these elements together equally, you get a map that looks something like this, where the darker the blue, the higher the priority. And in Green Valley Creek watershed, this map is a little hard to read because it's really fragmented by many relatively small parcels. And that's why doing this conservation assessment has been so valuable for us at the Land Trust, because it points us in the direction of where to focus our limited resources to get the most conservation outcome. And on this map, you'll see the darkest blues generally run along the stream corridors, but there are other properties that are also prioritized because they might have important groundwater recharge potential or floodplains that ideally would be reconnected to the stream to provide habitat as well as flooding attenuation. So a little bit more about our assessment. To conduct the assessment, we use existing data to do an analysis using GIS, so Geographic Information Systems. And we based our work on these 4 existing studies. One is work from O'Connor Environmental and Coast Range Watershed Institute, who prioritized where the fish are routinely found and where habitat conditions are suitable, where the geomorphic conditions are suitable, and where groundwater infiltrates the soil. So based on those things, they were able to prioritize areas. We also used the U.S. Geological Survey's basin characterization model, which is a statewide model that estimates groundwater and aquifer recharge. We also used Sea Grant's monitoring of the fish occurrences at all life stages and their wet-dry habitat that Mariska told us about just a minute ago. And then finally, we use the county's ag and open space districts mapping of creek channels and floodplains that they did for their Vital Lands initiative to really get a sense of what's on the ground. So overall, the conservation assessment is this 3-step process that was developed by Tom Robinson, who we hired for this project with funding from the Resources Legacy Fund and the Nature Conservancy. And the first step of the assessment process was to use this existing data that I just mentioned to produce the conservation value metric that ranks the amount of conservation value. Next, we transferred those values to property ownerships so that we could identify the high value properties. We need to see on the ground where, we work with willing landowners, we work at a parcel and property level, so we needed to see how that conservation value metric laid out with ownerships. And then this third step is to match actions for those high value ownerships based on the characteristics of that particular property. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of how this works. But first, I just wanted to get a little more detailed about the conservation value metric. Also, we call it CVM, because this is really the foundation of the work and shows the flexibility that it provides. And it's based on the 3 primary factors I talked about earlier: the upland riparian habitat, which is defined by 3 sub-factors: the stream valleys, upslope contributing areas, and headwater contributing areas, which are areas that Tom Robinson created based on existing data, including data from the Conservation Lands Network, which is a regional conservation strategy. That's what the acronyms are for. The in-stream habitat factor is just based on in-stream priorities, which were created by O'Connor Environmental, or OEI. And then stream flow is represented by groundwater recharge, the intention being to capture those areas where groundwater recharge benefits the stream flow where it's most needed. And this data are from O'Connor Environmental, OEI, and USGS the U.S. Geological Survey. And so then you can see the percentages, and this is just one example of how we can calculate a conservation value metric in which the factors are all even, but we can vary these percentages, give them different weights, depending on the question that we are answering, or the question that we're asking, so that we can get to an answer. And I'll show you what that looks like. So here, this map is of the Sonoma Creek watershed as an example, and we asked, where would avoiding conversion to subdivision and residential development be most important for coho recovery? So to answer that question, we looked at a conservation value metric that just focuses on the upland and riparian factor, because that's what matters for this question. And the darker the blue, the higher the value. So this looks at the stream valleys, the upland areas, and the headwater areas. And this was 100% looking at just that one factor. But in order to complete the analysis, we also run a query that adds in other mapped attributes in order to narrow down the field to the highest priority properties for specific action. So this list on the slide is, we have access to all of these data, as well as more spatial data that really helps us focus in on the kinds of properties we're looking for, the kinds of places that we're looking for to protect. So if we go back to our question about where it's most critical to acquire land or an easement to avoid a residential conversion, we take the CVM map and we add in the criteria that reflect what's most important for a fee or easement acquisition. So we take the high and very high conservation value, which are the two darkest shades of blue. We add in our development potential information. This identifies what development would be allowed per zoning. So that says what the threat is, if you want to put it that way, in terms of conversion to development. Plus, we add in information, a layer that's called human modification, that is based on the percent of impervious surface, percent of cultivated land, and road density, so that we can target areas that have a low level of modification by humans, because these are the areas we would want to protect with an easement or purchase, areas that are in more of a natural state. So running that query results in this watershed in 6 ownerships, which is what you see in the crosshatch areas on the map. And these are the areas that we would want to talk with landowners to see if there would be any interest in developing a fee or easement project. So this is one example that shows how we get onto the ground to the most important places for taking a particular action, and then it relies on working with willing landowners. And so we did 8 of these kind of scenarios, 8 types of projects that we see ourselves engaging in. And I'm just going to show you one more example of how this works, but I wanted to show you this table just as to show the range of analysis that the assessment can accommodate. So we looked at places to avoid conversion to development or conversion to agricultural crops, as this typically increases water use, and we're trying to keep water in the stream. We also looked at floodplains, where we want to avoid a conversion to a crop, or even removal of a crop, where it would be most beneficial for the stream flow. We also looked where floodplains, where restoration is most critical. And then we looked at forests and grasslands that could be managed in a way that benefits stream flow. And finally, we looked at places where water transactions would be appropriate, whether it's storing water or forbearing its use during the dry season, or releasing water from a pond or reservoir, or dedicating water to in-stream flow, those kind of water projects that we were talking about earlier. So we have this whole range of types of projects that we're interested in doing, and wanting to know where to do them, where we will have the most benefit. And so that's what we looked at with our spatial analysis. So this last this other example of is based on the scenario of where could we manage, where does it make the most sense to manage grasslands or forest lands for water, the water potential? So we took a conservation value metric that looks at the upland and riparian and stream flow. And so we are looking at places where we can improve, or the landowner could improve the soil quality of grasslands, or manage the forest in a way to create an uneven age forest that's been thinned to reduce the amount of water that is used by the trees on the property. And so when we take the high and very high conservation value and add in the vegetation management potential, we get a map that looks like this, with the crosshatches showing where this work would be the most important for fish and stream flow. And the vegetation management potential layer is where there are grasslands that are greater than 10 acres, or where at least 25% of the property has conifer stands greater than 10 acres that are all about the same age and are generally young, which would provide the opportunity to manage the forest in a way that would release water back into the stream. So in this scenario, in this watershed, 15 properties show up as candidates for discussions with landowners about management possibilities, or change in management, or ways to manage their property to have benefit for streams and water. So that's what Sonoma Land Trust is doing to respond to the decline of salmon in our watersheds. We are focusing on protecting water where it most contributes to the recovery of salmon, as that's really an indicator of overall watershed health. And we are sharing this work to encourage people to take action. So you too, if you live in these watersheds or in other watersheds, can think about how you use water in your home and on your property. You can reduce it, slow it down, sink it into the ground. You can also develop winter water storage, like we've been talking about, so you don't need to use as much water from your well or spring or creek or municipal supply during the dry season, which will leave more water in the creek when it really matters. And then on this slide, there is my contact information if you want to learn more about this, or what a project with us would look like. But I have one more slide, which are just some more resources, because as Mariska said, there's a lot of momentum right now, and there's some great organizations working on this effort. And so I wanted to mention a few also new initiatives that are going on. But first, there's the website for the Coho partnership that Mariska mentioned. There's some great a number of examples of project types on that website. And then our local resource conservation districts are incredibly helpful in this work. They've worked with many landowners to install water storage tanks, rainwater harvesting systems, among other improvements. And right now, there's an opportunity for landowners to participate in the Sonoma County Rainwater Harvesting Rebate Program, which provides rebates for rainwater capture systems. And the resource conservation districts are providing support, technical support for that. And you can find more information on the savingwaterpartnership.org website. Next initiative is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries have developed a voluntary drought initiative, in which they are looking to develop agreements with landowners to implement a range of water conservation strategies, flow augmentation, floodplain inundation projects, as well as agreements to allow stream monitoring and fish rescue on people's lands. So I provided an email contact if you're interested in working with those organizations on their initiative. And then finally, the State Water Board has just recently approved a voluntary water sharing agreement, which is for the upper Russian River, which for this program is considered upstream of the confluence of Dry Creek and the Russian River. So Alexander Valley North. And so this is a very unique agreement that allows water rights holders in the upper watershed to voluntarily reduce their water use and then share their available water. Interested parties must submit an enrollment form by June 20th, which is next week. So there's not a lot of time, but if you're interested, you can see the Water Board's website for more details. And again, I've included my email address if you'd like to follow up on any of this. I welcome conversations. And now I think we welcome questions. I'll pass that over to Neil to facilitate.
Wonderful. Well, first, thank you, Mariska, and thank you, Sara, for that wonderful presentation. Mariska, thanks for getting into some gory details how science works and the process, which involves a lot of walking through watersheds and counting fish in wetsuits. I really appreciate getting that inside view. And I think everyone that attended tonight can see why Sara was such an asset when she joined the Land Trust with those conservation planning chops. We would be lost without you. So I'm so happy to have you as a colleague, Sara. Thank you. I do want to thank everyone here. We will be getting to a Q&A session in a moment for those that would like to stay. Before you leave, you can make sure to keep engaged with Sonoma Land Trust by following any of our various social media accounts, which almost all of them are just at Sonoma Land Trust, or by visiting our website. Attendees, you'll be able to view past presentations and download educational materials, as well as access the recorded version of this presentation in a few days at our Sonoma Land Trust Nature at Home page, which is sonomalandtrust.org/nature-at-home. You can also keep an eye out for our monthly Language of Land webinars by signing up for our email, our e-blast, as well as visiting that website again. And we list all of our future presentations on our outings and events page. So you can go to sonomalandtrust.org/outings. Just a reminder that Sonoma Land Trust is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, which means we rely on the donations of individuals, businesses, and foundations to make all of this amazing work possible. If you like what you heard today, please consider donating. Your gift helps support land protection and preservation, including protecting those little fishies. To make a donation online, you can go to sonomalandtrust.org and click the donate button at the top. Thank you in advance for your generosity, and we appreciate everyone who supports our work. With that, we're going to dive into some questions. Before I get to the audience questions, I think that last part, Sara, is something that we want to reiterate, which is, I'm Joe Schmo, I'm at this webinar. Holy darn, my uncle's property is on that map and it's dark blue. What should I do?
Give me a call. You know, each property is unique. Each landowner is unique. What a landowner does on their property, what they want on their property is unique. And so, you know, this assessment got us in the right neighborhood of knowing which places on the ground really are the most important for this particular purpose, which is, you know, stream flow and salmon recovery. But they're, you know, that's just the beginning. So I would say, you know, give me a call, so send me an email, and we just start a conversation.
Wonderful. And I think that's something that, as my job as the Director of Community Engagement for the Land Trust, I always remind people is we do not force conservation on people. We can only do things with willing landowners. So if your Joe Schmo uncle is like, hey, I might, you can do us a favor and a solid by showing him this presentation and explaining the options and giving Sara a call. Mariska, I'm going to start with you with a question that I wrote down only because I was fascinated by your grasp of the scientific parts of monitoring, and you're probably the most familiar with all the data and what it's showing us. So my question to you is, Mariska, if you had unlimited money and unlimited power, you have all the power in the world, but you could only do one intervention to save salmon in the Russian River, what would you do? Where do you think those resources are best focused? And I know as a scientist, you're like, you can't just do one intervention. I totally get that. I'm just going to force you to say it.
I mean, as you saw from the presentation, I think flow is the biggest limiting factor to restoring these fish populations. I don't think there's like one type of project that you could do to restore flow, but I think anything we can do to improve stream flow. There's no way we can restore salmon populations without addressing the flow issue.
Yeah, well, that's very reassuring to hear as the Land Trust, who just established this strategic priority of increasing flow in hopes of helping the fish. I'm really happy to hear you say that. Quick couple questions. I think I want to intersperse a couple quick answers with some bigger answers. So one of them is about the hatchery fish that you mentioned, Mariska. Are the hatchery fish that are coming back that you're measuring, are they originally from the Russian River watershed?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to describe the hatchery program. It's actually a very well thought out, complex program. We have geneticists on the team from the National Marine Fisheries Service, Science Center down in Santa Cruz. And so they did a lot of genetic analysis at the beginning of the program, and they've been involved throughout, since it began in the early 2000s. And so some of the original fish that were brought to the hatchery to start this whole hatchery program came from those I showed a map of just 2 streams, the remaining fish. And so those fish from those creeks were collected as juveniles, actually from drying streams, and brought to the hatchery. And so they were the founding population for the Russian River captive broodstock program. For a number of years, it was only fish from those 2 streams, but the population was so small that there were issues with inbreeding. And so the program, the geneticists made a decision that there wasn't enough genetic diversity with just those 2 populations. And so they thought that it would be better to incorporate some genes from a neighboring stream system. And so some additional fish from the Alima Creek watershed just south of us were collected from the wild and incorporated into that population. And we've done some studies to evaluate that, was that a good choice or not? And we, what we've learned is that survival actually has increased since that outbreed. It's called outbreeding when you cross with neighboring streams. And so, yeah, so some of both, some of the original genes from the Russian, but also some genes from a neighboring watershed.
And that sounds maybe a little bit like mimicking natural systems where usually they're isolated, but there's always a little bit of genetic drift happening once in a while.
Yeah, actually, with some of these pit tag systems that we have, some of the neighboring watersheds are starting to put these systems, and we do see some exchange of fish.
You see some fish go that way, and you're like, no, you're supposed to be that way.
Yeah, but no, I mean, that's how things happen naturally is, they stray into different streams.
I mean, they're fish. Can't give them a roadmap. Sara, question for you, and you might laugh at this. The question is, has SLT completed a similar analysis for Mark West watershed? What's your plans for the future?
Right, so yes, this analysis does include the upper Mark West Creek watershed. There are 5 of these watersheds that we looked at, and Mark West Creek is one. It's been identified as a key critical stronghold or location for coho recovery. So yes.
Great. You answered that quick. Let me get over here. Mariska, you cited one of the, I believe it was a winery releasing water. The question is about which winery specifically, but I think maybe the other question is like, what do you look for with groups that might be interested in doing that kind of work? And are you looking at expanding that kind of process of working with people with water retention to do that? Because you looked like you had great success.
Yeah, so that project has, we've worked with Sonoma RCD, it's Gallo Vineyard, and we've partnered with UC Berkeley, some researchers at UC Berkeley, and Trout Unlimited has done some of the flow monitoring. So it's been this really nice collaboration. And in terms of, I think the Department of Fish and Wildlife and some of the resource conservation districts are the folks to reach out to if, if someone has a pond and is thinking about releasing water. Sea Grant doesn't coordinate the actual releases. We've sort of, our role has been to help decide like when it makes sense to do the releases and evaluate whether it's working or how we can, time it correctly to most benefit fish.
Yeah, you're doing like your introduction, right? You're doing that science and trying to get it off the shelf and get it to the people that can do that, can coordinate with a bunch of landowners to release water.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, great. Sorry, this is a question that I feel like only someone in our acquisitions department can answer. In conversations with landowners, how big or is financial compensation a significant factor in their decisions? And does more money necessarily lead to increased ability to do our conservation work?
Yeah, interesting. This is one reason we're excited to enter into this world of streamflow, is that the land trust and we believe other land trusts can bring additional tools to the table that haven't been used as much. Previously, like Mariska was showing, there's been a lot of in-stream restoration work that's been important. The land trust is used to doing easements and agreements and legal documents where we can have, where there's a compensation component. Because with an easement, we can value that. There is a fair market value to what you are restricting. So yes, we can bring some compensation to the table, which we are hoping will open the doors to additional projects. Yeah, was there some, and so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, money always helps, right? But there's lots of other stuff that goes into that. All right, there's a question. I am personally just fascinated by beavers, and we have a lot of people that are also interested about beavers. So I think this is probably towards Mariska, but Sara, feel free to jump in. Either returning of beavers or beaver analog dams, is that something the science is showing that, if you beavers used to create these pools, it recharges groundwater, it stores water during dry seasons, blah, blah, blah. You all know that. But have we been experimenting, or has there been experimentation with beavers themselves or beaver analog dams in the Russian River system as part of this solution?
I'm not aware of any analogs, and there haven't been reintroductions of beaver to the Russian, but there is a lot of talk of using that as an approach to help increase the water table, and just a lot of excitement about trying that on some different streams in the Russian. And so maybe Sara, I'm not aware of any that's actually happened yet, but I anticipate that is coming, and we're all really excited about that as a possible restoration technique and a way to provide more water for fish and improve habitat.
Someone's job is to get people excited about conservation. The idea of beaver conservation goals in the same, it's a slam dunk, right? I mean, keep beavers. Sara, I think this question might be for you, or maybe both of you actually. Interested about illegal stream diversions and how big of an issue is it? Do we see a lot of that? Is that a lot of contributing factor, or are we really talking about the normal routes, or what's really diverting most of the water?
Right, I can start, and Mariska, then you can add anything. I would say that, what is problematic, there's just a lot of straws into the groundwater and into streams. And so, people have wells that are near creeks. People have to get water from springs that may be connected to creeks. So, and they may or may not have a water right associated with that. And for some water that is taken through riparian rights, they should be reported to the state board, and so but aren't. So it's hard in a way to define what's illegal, but there's a lot that goes on that nobody has any idea of what's going on. And I think that's part of the challenge, is not knowing exactly who's taking water from where. And so, yeah, that's just what's going on in our, in our part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the streams that I'm most familiar with, I mean, part of it is we're not regulatory. We're not looking to see whether if there's diversions, we're not really looking to see whether, they're illegal or legal. But I think, like Sara said, I mean, it's not a case of just like a lot of like, direct pumping of water out of the streams. It's really more a lot of rural residential properties and wells next to the stream, and rather than just these big diversions taking the water directly out of the streams.
Yeah, like so many things in life, there's no villain we can just point to, right? It's death by 1,000 straws, it sounds like. All right, this is a bit of a technical question, and I think I know where they're coming from, and I want to just start by, we're not prefacing that, or I want to preface that we don't advocate for this, but and I think, Sara, this is probably for you, can it sounds like the question is, can an external group extinguish a water right?
Let's see. And maybe Mariska, maybe you know the answer to this. I think you can extinguish a water right. However, by doing that, it doesn't necessarily leave the water in the stream, because somebody else could then use that water. So if like the goal is to keep water in the stream, just extinguishing your water right isn't necessarily going to do that. It's better to dedicate it. It's the term of art, dedicate it to in-stream use, so that water must be kept in the stream, and not somebody else downstream can't take it. I mean, this is all water rights, and the way water works is all quite complicated, but I think that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. Sorry, look, Mariska, you look like you wanted to pass on that one, so we'll just move on. There's a lot of questions about trees, and I want to ask a couple questions about trees, probably to both of you. So aside from the impacts of climate change, just ask this question: what effects do more trees on the landscape than the historical norm? They're citing 1900. I assume they're pointing to fire suppression, increased vegetation, increased trees. What does that have on stream flow? And there's a couple other questions very similar around that, about removals of trees and how do trees actually impact water flow? I think are the theme of the questions here.
I can take a first start at this, and I think we're learning a lot more about this, especially through living through fires and burning forests. But trees need water to survive as well, and so I think the thinking in terms of management of forests in relation to water, my understanding at this point is, if you can thin the forest so there opportunity for trees to get bigger and older, those trees don't use as much water as if you have a very dense forest full of lots of young trees, because as they're young and growing, they'll be using more water. So the idea, and so there's a lot of benefits to doing that kind of work, both for forest health in general, and then one of the additional benefits is about water, at least water.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Just sort of an interesting tidbit is some of the watersheds that I work on really closely burned in the Walbridge fire, and Trout Unlimited has gauges out there, and there were some interesting increases in flow as after the fire. So I think there is something to that, just figuring out the right way to manage the forest for a lot of other reasons, but flow is one of them.
And it will be interesting to see over time as those forests come back, and there's a lot of young trees, what that does if they're not managed, if it's not managed, what that does to stream flow as well. Mm-hmm. And the goal here is definitely not to just remove trees for the sake, to have a denuded hillside. Yeah. It's really, we want the forest ecosystem. It's just that the composition of it can impact the water.
Yeah, and trees serve many other purposes, even just thinking about fish. They provide, stable stream banks. They provide canopy for shade and cover when the trees, naturally fall into the stream. That creates that wood in the streams that the fish love. So yeah, it's finding the right balance, and not one way or the other.
LWD, right? That's something I remember from undergrad in ecology class. LWD, always LWD is the answer. Large woody debris, and there's not enough of them. I love how technically nerdy our audience is. They're have some questions. So I'm going to throw a couple of these at you and see what you think. One is, will SGMA help you? Does anyone know what that acronym means? SGMA. Are you involved in the development of that plan in your basins?
I think that's in reference to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and sustainable groundwater management planning that is going on. And for Sonoma Land Trust, we're tracking it, but we're not directly involved.
Okay. Mariska, any?
No, same. I think groundwater is part of the whole solution for increasing flow in streams. So we're not directly involved, but yes, that's really important. Yeah.
Second, check on your policy tracking here. State Water Board and CFW began a minimum flow analysis in the Marquest Creek a number of years ago. This person's wondering, they haven't heard much about that. Does anybody know the status of that work?
I've been curious myself.
Oh.
Yeah, I've been aware that they did some work, but I'm not sure of the status. And
it's probably
same. My understanding is that they finished the field work, and they're analyzing the data, but I don't know. I'm not aware that there's a report out for the public to see yet. I haven't seen anything.
That analysis and writing part just takes a lot of time and review, as we all know. All right, let's get some other type of questions here. How, Mariska, this is probably for you and your research on populations and return. How much of an issue is human predation?
So in the Russian River watershed, the public is allowed to fish for steelhead. And one of the things that we were seeing, you're allowed to fish legally for steelhead. It's sometimes really hard to tell steelhead and coho apart. And so one of the things that a team of different organizations and agencies have tried to do is just help anglers understand some of the differences, the morphological differences between the species. The hatchery coho used to receive a fin clip that the steelhead receive. They clip the adipose fin, and that's a cue that it's a hatchery fish that you're allowed to fish for and keep. The coho used to have that clip, but they stopped doing that so that they wouldn't be mistaken for hatchery steelhead and taken. Another thing that we saw, when the river opens and the coho and steelhead come into the river, but they can't access the tributaries, they kind of get trapped in the river where there's a lot of angling pressure, and so they were getting hit pretty hard. One of the things that the agency, one way of addressing that was to implement a low flow closure. So when the flows are below a certain level, you're not allowed to fish. I think that's helped some. But there's no one size fits all in terms of a flow threshold. So there is still pressure on these fish at certain flows when they can't get into the tributaries and they're stuck in the river. So yeah, that is a source of potential mortality for the adults. Yeah.
I was going to say great, but it's not great. But
Yeah.
thank you for explaining that.
Mhm.
We're coming up on our time here, 8:30. So I'm going to ask one more heady question to Sara and let you spin your wheels as much as you want, because I don't know if there's a concrete answer here or a straightforward one. Are there, or if there are, what do you see as the synergies between carbon sequestration and storage, wildfire resilience, and salmonid habitat and survival? Do you see any place where those all start coming together and it can really help focus conservation?
Yes, definitely. And I think what we were talking about before in terms of forest management, if you manage for all of those things, there's a lot of similar management approaches, I think, that would result in those benefits, both carbon sequestration and wildfire resilience and salmonid restoration. So I think that's a great way to think about it, that really are, a lot of the issues that we are faced today, that, conservation and management in a certain way can really address a lot of it, have multiple benefits. The work that we do really does have multiple benefits. Well,
I know we heard a lot of doom and gloom, but I also appreciate how both of you focused on there are paths here. There are ways forward. There are successes. There are things that we can do, that people on this webinar can do. And I really appreciate that message at the end, that it may look dark, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, or there can be. All right, last question for each of you to end our day with something a little bit lighter here. Mariska, what is your favorite fish fact? Or just what's a great fish fact you like?
Yeah, I can't think of a fact, but one of the most fascinating things to me studying these populations is how much these fish move around in the watershed. One really cool thing that we saw one year is these little fish that were released into Willow Creek down near the estuary. In a huge storm in the winter, they migrated out of Willow Creek upstream in the main stem of the river in 40,000 CFS, a little tiny fish, a few inches long, went several miles upstream in the rain stem of the river and went into another creek where it spent the winter. So that kind of just blew my mind.
Oh, that's great. And Sara, your question is, all right, what's your favorite place to enjoy the river? Park, view, whatever. What's your favorite place?
Yeah, there are so many, but a recent example is I actually was out with Department of Fish and Wildlife in Willow Creek. In Willow Creek, actually, we were walking the creek to see where were the pools. Where were the pools and where was there large woody debris basically actually in there, and was it being helpful or not helpful, and in what ways? So actually being out in that watershed in the creek that was just gorgeous and cool and wooded and watery was pretty spectacular.
Well, thank you both. I do want to just point out that I love how technical this talk was. And as somebody that does education interpretation, my mantra usually is simplify for general public. But I think looking at these questions, the audiences that both of you brought, they want these details. They want to know how it works. And I think both of you have just blown us all away with your technical understanding and expertise. And I, for one, am incredibly excited and happy to know that the two of you are working in this watershed, because you obviously know it and you obviously care about it. And I really appreciate you taking the moment to share that with us in all of the nerdy detail about how all this stuff works. And it is the devil's in the details. So thank you all for that very much. I'd love to thank Mariska for your time from the Sea Grant program, and Sara Press from the Sonoma Land Trust for sharing your expertise and your careers and your passions with us. I'd like to thank Mariana, who is interpreting our webinar for us. And I'd like to thank all of you out there in Cyberland for tuning in. I'm seeing all the comments of how much people appreciate this presentation and really learn something. So thank you all. Thank you for coming. The recording will be up in a few days, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye,
Thank you.
folks.
Thank you.
Taking a look at the chat.